So we're going to jump into our text this morning, Ruth chapter 2, 1 through 13. And today's title is called Under His Wings. I'll read the word, and it will also be on our screen. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So the saga continues. We've been in the book of Ruth. This is our fourth sermon up to this point. When we started the series, we talked about how Ruth can often relate to us more than any other book because of how commonplace all that they're going through is. Where other parts of the Bible can seem to be a little bit more flashy. It talks about different miracles, even heroic stories of people who had amazing faith. But this story relates because it talks about the everyday struggles that we often go through. Many of the ones that you have gone through in your own life or are going through presently or have seen your loved ones go through. There's struggles of financial instability. There's struggles with sick family members and death. There's struggles of having children and struggles with not having children, barrenness. There's struggles with single parenting, the in-laws type of relationships. There's racism, there's depression, and there's bitterness. And Naomi and Ruth have seen it all. But today, finally, for this moment, things are about to change. This is like the turning point that we've all been waiting for. For the past 3 weeks, it's kind of been a dark sermon series, right? First, we talked about, we can mourn to God, come to God with our pleas, come to God in our suffering, come to God as bare bones as where we are. We don't have to make ourselves to be something else. We can just come honestly. And then second, we learned that how we are to love others and display love to others despite our sufferings. And last week, we talked about how we can grow in our sufferings. But this week, there's kind of concrete light in the tunnel. Up to this point, hope was simply like a faith statement, something that you're grasping onto. And the only thing you're really grasping onto is nothing other than faith that God will do something through it. But today, in the process of all that, God sheds his light. God shines his light. When reading this, I felt like I was kind of watching a romantic drama or kind of like a Disney movie or watching a chick flick of some sort. I'm sorry if that sounded offensive, but, one of those types of movies. And, I've watched my fair share of romantic dramas in the past. My sisters would watch it and my wife would watch it, so I'd get sucked into it. I'm not going to lie, I liked it too. It's fun stuff. They get you hooked on and you watch it all night. And there's a common element to any of these types of romantic dramas, right? There's two random people. You learn about their stories, and the whole time you're just wanting to know how they kind of get together. You see all this character build up, and you're like, these two have to be together. And I'm pretty sure some of the you matchmaking types in this room is like, your antennas are up, like, oh, Boaz, oh, perfect Ruth. And you're like, it has to happen. How does it happen? And today we see how they meet. We saw the character buildup of Naomi and Ruth up to this point. We've been through with them through their tears. We saw them in their suffering. We saw them with their heartaches. And now comes a man named Boaz. Boaz. And we'll definitely get to know him more. I'm actually going to preach an entire sermon on just him next week, particularly focusing on how we as men can live out biblical manhood from his example. So, if there is one week that you want to bring your husbands, like drag your husbands out if he's not with you, and then, after, or someone you're dating, bring him too, and after the sermon, you can be like, oh, what a pleasant surprise. Like, I didn't know he was going to talk about that. God works in mysterious ways, But here we see that Boaz gets a quick introduction before the story actually happens. The first sentence, you actually kind of have to read it as, like sometimes when you're watching a movie, they have that one sentence that comes out or that paragraph just to set the stage. That's what the first sentence is. And it goes like this. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So this is just kind of like that sentence that appears and you're like, oh, a relative, worthy man, what's going on, And real quick, there's a few things that we can learn about Boaz. One, he's a relative of Elimelech. And this should automatically kind of go as a ding, 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 something's about to happen. I mean, for us, when we're like, oh, a relative or a cousin, we're like, that does not sound romantic at all. But back in those days to the Hebrew community, they're like, oh, there's romance in the air. What's happening? And just as a reminder, it was particularly the case with Ruth and Naomi. Because what usually happened when there was a widow, when her husband died, his brother or another relative, a guy in the family, would marry this widow in order to preserve that name, in order so that they can redeem the inheritance that was supposed to be left to him. See, widows couldn't redeem that by themselves. They had to have an heir to pass it on to. So this was kind of like a social security net for widows. So any children that remarried widow would have with her husband's brother or another relative, those kids will receive any inheritance that was due to their dead father. So, this is kind of a moment like, they're going to get redeemed. But it gets even better. Not only was he a relative of Elimelech, they used a very special word. They called him a worthy man. Now, we miss a lot of the nuances of what this means in Hebrew. This translation of worthy man, this phrase is actually what, if you hear that, all the ladies would be like, worthy man. Yeah, I mean, just think of what you would think of when thinking about an eligible bachelor, marriage quality, good on paper and good in person. I mean, how would you describe him? I mean, worthy man has so many different nuances that it encompasses all these desirable characteristics. It's also translated as man of valor, mighty man, man of wealth, man of ability, man of honor and respect, man of noble character. I mean, it's talking about the whole package here and just this worthy man. Not to mention the name Boaz in Hebrew starkly contrasts Ruth's past husbands. If you guys remember, I don't know which one it was, but, both the brothers' name was Mahlon and Chilion, meaning weak and frail, and one of them were Ruth's husbands. There's a weak guy, and now there's Boaz. His name actually means strength. He's a man of ability and strength. I really hope, there's a lot of babies being born. One of you guys got to name him Boaz, why not, People are into unique names, and I was just saying the first service, Joe, his wife's name is Naomi. They're about to have a son, Boaz fits the theme. And anyways, just playing, that kid's going to hate me for the rest of his life. Boaz, what's that? But see, Boaz is introduced to be everything opposite of the hardships for this family. I mean, Ruth is a great person, strong woman of faith, very loyal, good character. We see that she's a hard worker as well. But we see a lot of flaws, at least during that time period, against her. One, she was a Moabite. Over and over again, they call her the Moabite or the foreigner. She's from a country that means who's your daddy. If you guys remember, Mo and Ab means who's your daddy. This was a country that was looked down upon because it originated from kind of forms of incest with Lot, Abraham's relative. She's a widow. Back then, they would have looked at her kind of as someone's leftovers. 3, she's poor. 4, she was barren for a while. I mean, these are all the things that you wouldn't want. So talk about the opposites attracting, right? There's a rich man, the worthy man, and then there's a poor girl. It's kind of a Cinderella story going on. So today it talks about how they meet. And, let me show you how the story goes on. I mean, Ruth, there's so much really to love about her. As they enter into Bethlehem, Ruth doesn't waste any time. She doesn't sulk. I mean, she's a widow too. She's lost a lot, but she's a survivor. She gets up and gets to work. See, in verse 2, it says this, and Ruth the Moabite, again talking about that foreigner emphasis, said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. What does this mean? There's a lot of hidden graces in the laws of God that protected the marginalized and the weak. And this is kind of how it went. I mean, if you guys look to Leviticus chapter 23, 22, God kind of instructs kind of rich people or landowners and says this, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. See, in this type of law, it's saying, hey, don't be so clean. Don't be so meticulous about taking every penny. Like, leave some out so people can pick it up. This was the law. So Ruth, learning this, goes out to glean in the fields, hoping that some owners would be gracious to her. I mean, the reason why she needs grace in this is because not everybody followed the rules. They needed food to survive, but it wasn't easy work. One, if you're a gleaner, you're out in the sun, like picking at leftovers. It's kind of like dumpster diving, kind of ancient dumpster diving, and you're doing it without proper tools. And even though if the law allowed gleaners, not everyone followed the rules. I mean, if you think about it, if you're a landowner, if you're a really smart business person, you count your pennies. I mean, you look at the bottom line. To not harvest all of your land to front to back with every little thing is basically giving away, 10 to 20% of your income. So there were certainly people back then that didn't like this practice. And when gleaners came, they would be kind of harassed. They would be kind of shooed away sometimes, even though it was the law. And there's instances where even evil workers would wait until the unfortunate people would gather everything, and then they would bully them out of their stuff. So Boaz, I mean, this is what's kind of happening. But Ruth goes out into the field. But let's look at the text. It says, as she's there, the text says she just happens to glean in the field of Boaz. I mean, what a coincidence. And it just happens that he came from Bethlehem to check out his fields. Another coincidence. So Boaz enters the scene, this hunk of a guy, also a really godly one. He's greeting people with blessings from God, saying, God be with you. But then he notices Ruth. So Boaz asks his foreman, whose young woman is this? I mean, this is another way of saying, who is she protected by? What clan is she from? What family is she from? Who's her husband? Why is she out here alone? Now, there's genuine worry about this because gleaning was not only hard work, but you have to kind of consider the context of a young woman working out in the fields without protection. Laborers were often rugged people. I mean, even today, there's stereotypes of construction workers, catcalling and stuff like that. But the truth was, unprotected women without family or a husband would be preyed upon, often taken advantage of, and even raped. So there's a reason why Boaz later goes on to say, hey, I'm going to protect you. No man's going to touch you. I'm going to make sure of that. See, even though this is a happy moment of meeting, there's a lot of anxiety behind it. So in verses 6 to 7, the foreman actually tells Boaz Ruth's story. Let me read this to you guys. He says, she is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came and she continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Now, there's something subtle here that scholars have noticed, but it shows Ruth's kind of boldness and courage. This woman doesn't just go up to pick up leftovers. She actually goes there and asks to work among the reapers. You don't need to ask to glean because that's law, but you would ask if you want something more. See, typically when harvesting a field, the hired men would first cut down everything, and then young women would come out to gather them and tie them in bundles. Ruth is actually kind of going in saying she's either asking for a job or she's asking to give her more than what's normal gleaning. And she's working really hard. She worked day and night, barely took a break. So as Boaz hears this, he looks to Ruth and tells her not to glean anywhere else. He says, stay here. My protection is going to be over you. In fact, my young men are going to even give you water, so stay here. And when Ruth hears this, she falls to her face because this is not a normal generosity. This is far more than this charity. And then she asks him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you would take notice of me? Why? Again, she's pointing to her status since I am a foreigner. But Boaz answers her like this. All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. and you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Guys, there's only really two things I want you to leave here with. I just want to keep it simple. A lot of people don't remember anything after a sermon. If there's two things just to remember. Two things to put into practice that lead to Ruth seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. One is real simple. Faithfulness in the day-to-day mundane things. Faithfulness of Ruth. Faithfulness in moving forward despite the hardships. And two, seeing the providence of God, that he's always under control. And these two things are like, I've heard it all before. But these two concepts, although they seem pretty obvious, it's a mystery on how they work all together. Everything is in God's hands, yet we're called to be faithful and live out our best in every situation. See, Boaz notices these two things working together. He basically says, why am I showing you grace? It's because I've seen all that you've done for your mother-in-law. I've seen all that you have left behind to come here. May God bless you for that. But he doesn't end there. He doesn't just say, hey, your faithfulness is going to lead to blessing. He says, your faithfulness is there because of something else. He goes on to say this, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He's like, as you have come under his wings, as you've come under his control, as you placed your trust in me, as you placed yourself under his grace, under his providence, under his control. These two things are working together in almost everything we do. The faithful steps of man done within the greater providence and grace of God. Proverbs 16:9 says this, the heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 19:21, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. These Proverbs, sometimes you think that they're working at opposite ends of each other, but it's actually saying, no, everything kind of works together. Yes, everything is in God's hands, but all of our choices, our work ethic, our character, all that we do make a difference. This proverb is showing these two forces working together. Sometimes, the reason why I say this is sometimes when pastors or people talk about the sovereignty of God, we automatically think, oh, I don't have to do anything. It's all in God's hands anyway. I've met guys in seminary that says, all I have to do is pray. I don't have to study. And I'm like, no, idiot, go study. You're going to fail. Go. Some people say, hey, why try? It's in God's hands anyway. Why eat medicine? Why get treatment? Why God is sovereign? God's going to provide. No way. God is calling us to be faithful in all things, not because God is not in control, but we're called to be faithful because of the faith that we are in God's hands, and every moment is a God-given opportunity. And Ruth goes out. There are times when people come up to me and they ask me, hey, what do you think God wants me to do in this situation? Or what is God's will for me? What decision should I make? How during hard times, after you get out of something, people start to wonder, what are my next steps? How should I proceed? What's God's will for my life? How do I make sure that I'm in God's will? When talking about God's purposes and will, there's two things that you need to know. There's two wills that God shows us. One is God's revealed will. These are things that God has shown us through his word. These are like the commandments that he gives us, the instructions of faithful living. These are the promises of God, promises of salvation. These are the revealed wills of God. But there's also a hidden will. The hidden wills of God are things that are kept secret to us, the things that are going to happen in our future, the exact moments of what's going to happen in our life, the things, the jobs that we'll have, the guy you're going to eventually marry, all those specific things. See, God never tells us that he's going to show us his secret will, but he says focus on the revealed ones. Cling on to my promises, follow my commands, be faithful onto the day-to-day. He's saying, what are we called to do? Simply hold on to God's promises and live faithfully each moment, striving to live according to the character that he calls to, living faithfully moment by moment, not preoccupied with what is to come, but seeing each moment as a God-given opportunity to be faithful. This means being faithful even though we don't know what we're called to do. Sometimes I find a lot of people, especially among youngsters, they're paralyzed because of this moment. I don't know what God wants me to do. So because of the lack of vision, they stop doing anything. No, even when you don't know what to do, stay faithful in the small things that God places in your life. Be faithful by the moment to moment. Be faithful at your church. Be faithful in your studies. Be faithful at your workplaces. Be faithful with your families. Be faithful in the small things, not just the big of what we think should be happening. See, many people only look to big things that God might do. And they'll say, oh, I'm going to work hard right when God throws me that big bone, when God comes to me in that moment. And then often ignore the small things that God places in front of us on a daily basis. Don't ignore the small things. Oftentimes, it's faithfulness to the small things that God uses to train you for the big. See, Ruth didn't go out looking for a man. Like when I first read this, I thought she's going to go man and find favor. No, that wasn't the point. She goes out and she's working hard and she happens to find a man. She didn't go out there trying to find a direct purpose for everything she was going through. She wasn't forcing something into it. She wasn't walking out with entitlement because of whatever she went through. She didn't sit down pondering, I became a widow and my mother-in-law became a widow. Therefore, I'm going to have a strong man. I deserve it. Man, I married weak and frail. I'm going to marry a strong man. I'm going to marry Boaz. I'm going to go out there and find my Boaz. She doesn't do this. Sometimes there's a tendency in her pain to find out her own meaning within her suffering. And don't get me wrong, it's not wrong to dream. But what life has taught me, that the plans of God cannot be manufactured. It never works out when we try to manipulate it, but they're discovered in our daily faithful walk. And we're just called to be faithful day in and day out in the big and little things. I mean, faithfulness faithfulness in seemingly non-sexy things in life is so important. Because oftentimes in the faithfulness of the small things, God will open up bigger doors. In the field of ministry, I meet young guys all the time who say they want to do great things, but they're not faithful in the small things. Therefore, they never get to the big things. Luke 16:10 says this, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And the one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. Jesus Christ drops this line down, after he's talking about the faithfulness of people, saying, hey, even look at other people that are just faithful in life. He's saying that he was like, man, faithfulness in the small things matter because they become the bridge of our character to be able to handle bigger things. Sometimes I wonder, how would it have played out if Ruth woke up and decided that she was going to go out and find her sugar daddy? I'm going to go out and find him, wear some fat, flashy clothes. I'm going to go into the marketplace. I'm going to find my suitor. I'm going to look all good. Who's a relative of Elimelech, and go out there and flaunt her stuff, try to seduce him. I wonder if a guy like Boaz would notice her. I really doubt that, quote unquote, a worthy man would have taken notice. In fact, when we look at the passage, Boaz doesn't see any of that. Every time in Scripture, if a man notices a woman for her beauty or how she looks, they would write that in. I mean, you see that with Jacob, Rachel was pleasing to their eyes and stuff like that. But no, it doesn't say any of that. But notice what Boaz sees. He notices the small, faithful acts, the loyalty of coming with her mother-in-law when there were no promises with her. He sees the small, faithful acts of leaving everything she knew behind just to go out and the small things of going out there, working in the fields, working there all day, only taking one break. And on the surface, Ruth meets Boaz in not so much of an attractive moment. I mean, think about the worst time to ever meet the man of your life. While you're all sweating, you got your sweat coming down all here and everything's all messed up. You've been working all day and then you meet Mr. Perfect and you're like, oh. But that's where he sees him. And this person, all he sees is the small, faithful acts. When I was looking at Ruth, I feel like a lot of us, we kind of live that day, that type of life every day, right? A lot of times people think that holiness to God, right, is going out there, going on missions and doing great things. But more and more I realize, man, faithfulness and living out your faith goes into very small things in life. Every moment that you wake up to go out to work and do your best is a moment where you're serving God. Every moment where you do something for your child, even though you're so tired and you make food, that's serving God in a different way. All those little things really matter, because there's a lot of people that go out boldly saying they're going to do things for God, but they lack being faithful in those small things, and you see everything fall apart. This is living God's kingdom out day in and day out, not in so much of the flashy things, but in the small things, faithfulness in the small little things. Man. And then through that, you begin to see God's providence. God's providence, what John Piper calls God's sweet and bitter providence. Just trusting, walking, living out the day-to-day, and then God shows up. And then we find out that we were never outside of God's hands and that he's been working in every detail of our life. And, when reading Ruth, it came on me. They kind of play around like when the Hebrew people are reading this book, they use a lot of phrases, oh, so happened that Boaz came, oh, so happened this happened. Or, they use a lot of like, oh, it was just random chance that this happened. But every person reading this text never looks at anything as luck. They look at it and say, wow, it's in the hands of God. I mean, just check this out. Naomi and Ruth begin their journey to Bethlehem. And God just happens to bring food back to Bethlehem after a long time of famine, right after Naomi loses her husband and boys. Then they are back and they just happen to be at the beginning of Barley Festival, a time of celebration and a time of harvest where gleaners can actually go into the fields. Then Ruth goes out to glean, and it just happens that she ends up gleaning in the field of Boaz, who just happens to be a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's dead husband. And it just happens that Boaz comes out into the field, and it just happens that he notices Ruth, and it just happens that he heard of Ruth out somewhere else because Naomi was talking about it. I mean, all this is just happens. The story was written for people to look at it and be like, wow, this is anything but luck, but God has been here this entire time. I've heard so many testimonies of people who have come to me and said, I think I came to faith because certain things happened that were too designed to be random. It's like those oh my God moments saying, wow, that could only be God. I've certainly had a lot of those stories of my own where I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And all I can look up and say thank you. It wasn't planned. But my life would not have been the same without it. And some of you have them too, I bet. And you realize, at least for that moment, it was so real that God was looking out for you. But let me tell you, it's not just for that moment. He's always been there. And you have always been under the shadow of his wings. That even in our faithful walk, or maybe even in our faithless walks, he never forgot you. Whether or not you realize it or not, in all those curves and turns and dips that have led you to where you are, all those small moments of faithfulness, tears and struggles, and even the moments of faithlessness, and even your sins were there to bring you where you are. And this was certainly true for Ruth. I'm going to invite the praise team up. All the intricacies of her life, literally up to this point to Christ. Not just in her genealogy, but the Christ who lives in her life as well and lives through her life. I mean, there's so many things here, It drives us to intimacy with Christ while also giving us an opportunity to live out Christ. Christ, he always lived out the little faithful moments. His faith that he lived on earth, the faithful moments where he healed the sick, the faithful moments where he would go out and pray in the morning, the faithful moments in his ministry, even faithful to the point of death, going low so that glory may be shining through his life and even in ours. And guys, we have that too. Not so much of faithfulness that leads to our success on earth, but our faithful walk with Christ and our faithful walk in Christ that leads to our glory at the end of time, where his victory becomes our victory through faith. And then after all is said and done, we will one day learn and see why all this has happened in our life, maybe written down somewhere, where we can see that all those little faithful things have led to something great. I just want to read to you guys Psalm 23. It's been something on my mind recently more and more. But I just want to read this to you guys twice, and I pray that it may become a gospel to your soul. It goes like this. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all of the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Let's take a moment. I want to give you guys a moment to pray. One, let's pray that God may give us the courage and boldness like Ruth to be able to live faithful in the day-to-day moments of our life. Maybe some of you in this room have been struggling just to walk another day. Maybe in a lot of the things that you've been through, you're like, man, I don't know if I can move on. Pray that God may grant you the strength to walk another moment, to walk in faith. And not in just the big things waiting for a bone to come, but just in the little things that God provides on a day-to-day, that God may give you strength to move forward in that. And secondly, let's also pray that God may give you the eyes of faith to see the awesome, sweet, and also oftentimes bitter providence of God over your life. That every turn and every dip and even every sinful moment will be used to redeem you and to bring you up on that J curve that we learned about last week. Let's take a moment just to pray. I want to give you an opportunity to pray over different components of your life, asking God to help you walk that walk of faith. Let's take a moment to pray.